The gathering, a night they'll never forget. It started like any other weekend. Just three college guys desperate for something to do. Jack, Ryan, and David weren't the kind of guys who got invited to every big event on campus. They weren't in fraternities, didn't have girlfriends, and spent most weekends in David's dorm, passing time with video games and cheap beer. So when Ryan told them about a party a girl had invited him to, it felt like a golden opportunity. "This one's gonna be different," Ryan insisted. "It's not some frat house full of sweaty guys and cheap jungle juice. It's a mansion. Rich people, crazy views, real liquor." David raised an eyebrow. "And you trust this girl?" Ryan smirked. "Why wouldn't I?" That night they piled into David's car and drove 20 minutes out of town. The roads became narrower, winding into an unfamiliar neighborhood. The houses here weren't student rentals with peeling paint and broken porch railings. These were estates, hidden behind wrought iron gates and lined with towering trees that blocked out the moonlight. "Ugh. This looks expensive," Jack muttered, staring out the window. Ryan checked his phone. "We're almost there." When they reached the house, it was massive. 3 stories of pristine architecture, ivy creeping up its stone walls, warm golden lights spilling from arched windows. The front doors stood open and a steady stream of guests filtered inside, their laughter drifting into the night. David whistled. "Damn, this is some Gatsby-level stuff." But Jack felt it immediately. A prickling unease at the back of his neck, the kind of sensation you get when you know you're somewhere you don't belong. The people entering the house weren't dressed like typical college kids. There were no backward baseball caps, no hoodies or sneakers. The men wore tailored suits, the women in long, elegant dresses. Jack hesitated. "Are we underdressed?" Ryan scoffed. "Relax, man, no one cares. It's a party." They walked inside, and that's when the unsettling details began to pile up. For one, all the lights were on, bright and clinical. No dim mood lighting, no strobe effects, just full overhead chandeliers illuminating every inch of the house. It was almost sterile. And then there was the music. No bass-heavy hip-hop, no pop hits. Instead, an eerie, almost hypnotic instrumental played, flowing from unseen speakers. It wasn't bad, exactly, but it wasn't the kind of thing anyone would dance to. Jack scanned the room. The guests, they were too composed. There was laughter, conversation, but none of the usual wild energy of a party. No one was drunk. No one was spilling drinks or shouting over the music. "They're just bougie?" Ryan said, sensing Jack's discomfort. "Rich people party different." David nodded, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling, like they were being watched. As they made their way toward the drinks table, a woman in an emerald green dress turned to them. She was stunning, but something about her smile felt rehearsed, too symmetrical, like a mannequin brought to life. "Welcome," she said. Her voice was too smooth, her eyes too sharp. "First time here?" Ryan grinned. "Yeah, our friend invited us." The woman's expression didn't change. She tilted her head slightly, studying them like they were the ones on display. "We don't get newcomers often," she murmured. "I hope you enjoy the night." Then she walked away, disappearing into the crowd before Jack could ask what she meant. "Okay," Jack muttered. "That was weird." David chuckled. "Dude, she was hot. You're overthinking it." Jack wasn't so sure. They grabbed drinks, top-shelf whiskey, not the cheap stuff usually handed out at college parties. Jack took a sip and nearly choked. It was strong, almost too strong. Ryan wandered off, still scanning the crowd for the girl who had invited him. Jack and David found themselves near the grand staircase, watching the party unfold. Then Jack noticed it. At first it was subtle, a pattern in the way people moved, the way they turned their heads at the same time, the way they spoke in low, rhythmic tones. It was like the whole party was choreographed, like an invisible hand was guiding every movement. David nudged him. "Dude, look at the doors." Jack turned. The front doors were closed. Not just closed, but locked. Heavy iron bolts slid into place. Jack's pulse quickened. "That's not normal." Then, the music stopped. All conversations ceased at once. The guests turned. All of them, their eyes locking onto Jack, David, and Ryan. the only three outsiders. Jack's breath hitched. We need to leave, now. Ryan reappeared, face pale. That girl I was talking to? She's gone. Her number, her messages, they're just gone from my phone. The tension in the air was suffocating. The once friendly smiles around them had twisted, becoming something else entirely. Then a deep voice from the staircase. We're so glad you could join us tonight. A tall man stood at the top of the stairs, dressed in a black suit. His face was obscured in shadow, but his presence demanded attention. You were invited here for a reason, he continued, his voice eerily calm. We don't get newcomers often. Jack took a step back. We were just leaving. The man laughed, low, amused. I'm afraid that's not possible. And the lights went out. Everything descended into chaos. Jack grabbed David's arm. Run! The room exploded into movement. Hands reached for them, bodies shifting unnaturally in the dark. Jack shoved past someone, barely dodging fingers that nearly latched onto his wrist. David was right behind him, and Ryan. Where was Ryan? The music returned, but it wasn't music anymore. It was whispers, layering over each other, thick with words that didn't make sense. Jack's heart pounded as they reached the back of the house, yanking on a door. Locked. A low voice hissed in his ear. Don't fight it? Jack swung blindly, connecting with something solid. A groan. He didn't stop to see who, or what, it was. He and David stumbled down a hallway, searching desperately for an exit. A window. David grabbed a chair and smashed the glass. The sound was like a gunshot cutting through the whispers. They climbed out, feet hitting cold grass. Behind them, the house stayed silent. They ran. Ran until their lungs burned, until the house disappeared into the night. Ryan never came out. The next morning, Jack and David returned with the police. But the house, it was empty. No music, no guests, no furniture, no Ryan, just a vacant mansion, abandoned for years. And the invitation that had started it all? It was gone, like it had never existed. Into the wild, a night of fear in the Rockies. The first text came just after nightfall. It was a crisp evening in the Rocky Mountain National Park, the kind of night where the wind carried the scent of pine. The stars burned bright against the vast darkness, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the soft murmur of a creek nearby. Ethan had come here to escape, to disappear into the quiet wilderness, far away from everything and everyone. He had spent the past year running, not from the law, not from debt, but from people who had ruined his life. Now, he just wanted solitude, peace. But then his phone buzzed. At first he ignored it. No one should have been texting him. Not here, not now. The only people who had his number were his immediate family, and even they had stopped checking in as much since he'd chosen to live off the grid. No one was supposed to know where he was. But when it buzzed again, a second time, and then a third, a strange unease crept over him. He hesitated before pulling his phone from his jacket pocket, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. His stomach tightened. How's the camping trip, Ethan? He went cold. The fire crackled in front of him, casting flickering shadows against the trees, but suddenly, it didn't feel warm anymore. His skin prickled, and his mind raced through the possibilities. No one knew he was here. He had told no one. He had driven into the mountains alone, parked miles from any official campsite, and hiked deep into the woods. There were no cabins nearby, no signs of other campers. He was completely alone. Or so he had thought. A second message came through. It's a beautiful night out here, isn't it? Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He lifted his head from the glow of his phone and scanned the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. Trees, rocks, nothing else. But the shadows felt deeper, thicker. He swallowed hard and typed back. Who is this? No answer. He sat there, gripping his phone with white-knuckled fingers, waiting. Minutes passed. The silence stretched too long. And then, a third text. I see you. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He shot to his feet, his boots crunching against the cold earth. The wind had died down, leaving only the eerie, unnatural stillness of the forest. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth no longer comforting, but instead feeling like a beacon, making him visible, exposed. His hand went to his side, fingers wrapping around the cold steel of his SIG P365 handgun. He hadn't needed to use it since moving off-grid, but tonight, it had never felt more necessary. Slowly, he backed away from the fire, stepping into the cover of the trees, hoping to see before being seen. Then, a sound. A footstep. Crunch. He wasn't alone. The realization hit him like a freight train. Someone was out there, watching. His breath came short and fast, his heart beat a frantic drum in his chest. He held his phone up, using the dim glow to scan his surroundings, but the light barely penetrated the thick blackness of the woods. Then, movement. Just beyond the tree line, where the firelight couldn't reach. A shadow shifted. Ethan raised the gun, hands trembling, aiming into the dark. "Who's there?" His voice was hoarse, cracking from the tension. No response. And then, a flash. For a split second, something lit up the darkness. A camera flash. Someone had just taken a picture of him. His phone vibrated, a new message. With a sinking dread, he forced himself to look at the screen. It was a photo of him, standing there, gun raised, face pale, taken just seconds ago. His blood turned to ice. Whoever this was, they were close. Another text followed. "Have a good night, Ethan." That was it, no more messages. The air grew impossibly still. The fire crackled softly behind him. A false sense of warmth in a world that had suddenly turned alien and hostile. And then, footsteps. Rushing, running, coming right at him. Without thinking, Ethan fired 2 shots into the air. The explosion of sound shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The footsteps stopped. Then, scrambling. Whoever it was, they were retreating. Ethan stood frozen, gun still raised, listening as the sounds faded, the intruder disappearing into the darkness. But they weren't gone. Not really. He was shaken. But he knew one thing. They'd be back. For the rest of the night, Ethan didn't sleep. Every rustling leaf, every distant hoot of an owl sent his nerves into overdrive. He sat with his back against a tree, weapon in hand, his eyes never leaving the darkness beyond his dying fire. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, he was already packing. He didn't bother eating, didn't bother double-checking his campsite. He just needed to leave. The entire hike back to his truck, he felt watched. The trees felt wrong, too silent. The usual morning bird song was absent, replaced by an eerie, expectant quiet. When he finally reached his truck, he yanked open the door and threw his gear inside. His hands were shaking as he started the engine. And then, his phone buzzed. One last time. With a sickening dread, he forced himself to look. A single message from the unknown number. "See you next time." Ethan peeled out of the parking lot, tires kicking up dust as he sped away from the mountains. He didn't look back. He never went camping alone again. The screaming woods. A night of terror. The first scream came just after midnight. At first, Dylan thought he had imagined it. A trick of the wind, maybe. The 4 of them, Dylan, his younger brother Adam, and their cousins Jake and Tommy, had spent the past few hours holed up in their tent, playing Uno by flashlight, laughing at inside jokes, and reliving the afternoon's adventures. Their dads had dropped them off deep in the Michigan wilderness, just past the marked property line of their uncle's hunting land, telling them it would be a great experience. "You boys will be fine, it's just one night." Uncle Rob had grinned, ruffling Tommy's hair before he and Dylan's dad disappeared back toward the house. It had seemed like a good idea at the time, an adventure. 4 cousins camping under the stars, proving they weren't kids anymore. But now, in the dead of night, something felt wrong. The wind had died completely, leaving an eerie, unnatural silence hanging over the woods. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just nothing. And then, the second scream. It was closer this time. Dylan's breath hitched in his throat. he turned toward the others, their faces barely illuminated by the dim glow of their flashlights. Jake's wide eyes met his. "Did you hear that?" Dylan nodded, suddenly feeling much younger than his 13 years. His fingers gripped the deck of Uno cards, the game instantly forgotten. "Foxes," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "They scream like that." But Tommy, the youngest of the group, was already trembling. He didn't look convinced. A third scream ripped through the night, this time directly outside their tent. And then the tent began to shake. The thin fabric walls trembled violently as something, or someone, gripped and pulled at them, rattling the poles, trying to get inside. Panic exploded through the group. Jake let out a strangled yelp, scrambling backward into the sleeping bags. Adam clutched his flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. Tommy was already on the verge of tears, his hands pressed over his mouth to keep from sobbing. Dylan's mind raced. Was it a prank? Their dads trying to scare them? That had to be it, right? Then came the whisper. From just outside the tent, a voice, low, raspy, unmistakably human, hissed Dylan's name. What? His blood turned to ice. Run! The scream tore from his throat before he even processed the words. He lunged for the tent's zipper, yanking it open in one frantic motion. The cold night air rushed in, chilling him to the bone. He barely registered his cousins scrambling after him, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. But as they ran, as they sprinted blindly through the darkened woods, weaving between the trees, hearts hammering in their chests, Dylan realized something that made his stomach drop. The screaming hadn't stopped. It was still behind them, moving, chasing, and it was getting closer. Dylan didn't stop, didn't look back, he just ran. Branches tore at his face, brambles snagged his clothes, but he pushed forward, lungs burning. He could hear Jake wheezing behind him, Adam cursing under his breath, Tommy sobbing outright. But they were almost there, almost back to the house. Then, suddenly, lights. The glow of the cabin porch cut through the trees like a beacon, golden and warm. Salvation. Dylan didn't slow down. He barreled toward the light, the others right on his heels. They practically collapsed onto the porch, gasping for air, pounding on the front door like their lives depended on it. The door flew open. Their dad stood there, beers in hand, confused and startled by the sight of 4 terrified boys shaking and out of breath. "Jesus Christ, what happened?" Dylan's dad demanded, grabbing him by the shoulders. The words poured out all at once. The screams, the shaking tent, the whisper, the chase. For a moment, their fathers just stared. And then Dylan realized something. His sister and girl cousins weren't here. He turned wildly to his uncle. You sent Jamie or Christina to scare us, right? That was them, right?" But Uncle Rob shook his head. "The girls are asleep. They've been inside all night." Silence fell over the room. A cold, sinking dread settled in Dylan's stomach. Then, his father spoke, his voice low. "You boys said this happened past the property line?" Dylan nodded, throat too tight to speak. His father exchanged a look with Uncle Rob, a look Dylan didn't like. Then, without another word, they grabbed their rifles. Dylan's mother protested, but the men ignored her. They were already heading out the door, disappearing into the dark woods. The boys huddled together in the living room, waiting. Minutes dragged into hours. Then, footsteps on the porch. The door creaked open. The men walked back inside, faces pale. "Nothing," Uncle Rob muttered. "Not a damn thing." But Dylan knew better. He saw it, the way their fathers avoided their eyes, the way their hands trembled ever so slightly as they set down their rifles. Something had been out there. Something had been watching them. That night, no one slept. And the next morning, when the boys returned to their campsite to retrieve their belongings, they found the tent exactly as they had left it. Except for one thing. A single deep scratch, too long, too deliberate to be an accident, ran down the side of the fabric, as if something had been trying to get inside. And from that night forward, none of them ever camped in those woods again. The vanishing campsite, a nightmare in the wilderness. The first time James heard his name, he thought it was just the wind. The mountains of Oregon's backcountry were known for their eerie silence, a kind of quiet so profound that it made the world feel frozen in time. James had come here to escape, to unplug, to leave behind the chaos of his life, the mistakes, the angry phone calls, the past that refused to let him go. He figured a week of isolation by a remote creek in Willow Ridge National Park would be the perfect way to clear his head. But on the second night, the texts started. His phone had been buried in his backpack, untouched since he arrived. There was no reception out here, not even a single bar. And yet, at 10:37 p.m., his phone vibrated. James frowned. No one should be able to contact him. He dug out his phone, his pulse quickening as he saw the notification. Unknown number. The message was simple. "How's the camping trip, James?" His stomach twisted into a knot. He hesitated, staring at the screen. How did they know his name? Then another message. "It's beautiful out here." James's breath caught in his throat. His fingers felt numb as he typed out a reply. "Who is this?" No response. The fire crackled softly beside him, its glow casting flickering shadows against the towering pine trees. Beyond the circle of light, the forest stretched out into blackness, endless, unknowable. James felt exposed. Someone was out there, watching. He stood up, slowly turning in a circle, scanning the woods. Nothing. Just the sound of the creek gurgling nearby, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. His fingers tightened around the hunting knife strapped to his belt, just in case. A full hour passed. James forced himself to believe it had been some kind of glitch, maybe a delayed message sent before he lost reception. But then, at 11:42 p.m., his phone vibrated again. Another text. This time it was a photo. His heart stopped. The image was of his tent, taken from somewhere in the woods behind him. James froze. Every hair on his body stood on end. Whoever had taken this was close. Too close. His breathing became shallow. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the handgun inside his pack. He had never felt the need to bring a weapon camping before, but tonight he was grateful for it. He scanned the tree line again, his thumb brushing over the safety of the gun. Still nothing. And then, footsteps. Soft. Careful. Just outside the glow of his dying fire. James's stomach clenched. He stepped back toward his tent, gun raised. Then, a flash. A brief flicker of light like someone had just snapped a photo. James whirled around, pointing the gun toward the direction of the flash. But the trees were empty. And then his phone vibrated one last time. He didn't want to look. Didn't want to know. But his hands moved on their own, unlocking the screen. One new message. It was only 3 words. "Have a good night." A rush of adrenaline tore through him. Enough. He turned toward the darkness, aimed his gun, and fired 2 shots into the air. The noise exploded through the silent woods. And then, movement. A blur of footsteps, running, sprinting, fading into the distance. James's heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then, silence. Whoever it was, they were gone. But James didn't sleep that night. He sat by the dying fire, gun in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. And when it finally did, when the first pale light of dawn broke through the trees, he packed up his gear without a second thought. He had survived the night, but as he slung his backpack over his shoulder and turned to leave, his breath caught in his throat. There, carved into the tree beside his tent, was his name. Deep, precise, fresh. James. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but he couldn't, not yet, because on the ground beneath the carving, half buried in the snow, there was a footprint, a single footprint, facing his tent. And the horrifying part? It wasn't his. Life is full of unexpected dangers, and sometimes the scariest stories aren't just fiction. They're real experiences that remind us how fragile our sense of safety can be. Whether it's a harmless-looking party that turns sinister, a mysterious stalker in the woods, or an unknown force lurking in the darkness, these stories teach us valuable lessons about awareness, instincts, and survival. Always trust your gut. If something feels off, whether it's a stranger's odd behavior, a sudden message from an unknown number, or an eerie presence in the night, listen to that feeling. Never ignore red flags. The world isn't as safe as we'd like to believe, and being too trusting or ignoring warning signs can put us in real danger. Prepare for the unexpected. Whether you're alone at night, traveling, or attending an unfamiliar event, always have an escape plan, keep your phone charged, and if needed, carry something for protection. If you love real horror stories that expose the darker side of reality, subscribe to Johan Co Horror now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a terrifying new tale, because sometimes the scariest things are waiting just outside your door.